The following episode features descriptions of physical and sexual assault, murder, and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. It was October 6, 1986, when Mary Nielsen found herself with a spare few hours between her part-time job at the deli and her lectures at the University of Western Australia. Remembering she needed new tyres for her car, she decided to visit a spare parts yard in the southern suburb of Myrie. There, the 22-year-old met David Birnie. David, short and thin, with dark hair and a hooked nose, suggested she come by his house for a better deal. When Mary entered the home of David, which she shared with his partner Catherine, she was held at knife point, threatened, bound up and chained to the bed. Catherine sat and watched while David raped Mary, a sadistic fantasy they had both concocted over many months, if not years. As night fell, the pair took Mary to Gleneagles National Park, where she was killed and buried in a shallow grave. It would only take 2 weeks for Catherine and David, both 35 years old, to abduct a second victim, 15-year-old Susanna Candy. What took place over the next month would come to be known as the Morehouse Murders, with Catherine and David among the country's worst ever serial killers. Soon, though, it would all come to an end, and police would discover a bizarre scene at their home in Willagee, Western Australia. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamma Mia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. This is the second episode in a 2-part series investigating husband and wife serial killers David and Catherine Birnie. If you've not listened to the first episode, we recommend going back and catching up on part 1 before listening to part 2. At the end of part 1, David and Catherine Birnie had taken the life of their first known victim, 22-year-old Mary Frances Nielsen. In this episode, we continue speaking with journalist and author Andrew Byrne as he explores the tangled web of the Birnie's crimes. The Birnie's second victim, who was Susanna Candy, she was only 15, and she was hitchhiking 2 weeks after David and Catherine had kidnapped and murdered their first victim, Mary Nielsen. What happened to Susanna that day?
So Mary Nielsen was enticed to the house and followed David Birnie. They tried other ways to get victims. They'd placed advertisements in the local paper looking for single women. And in fact, some of the earlier victims, who they were never convicted of, may have responded to that ad, and that's how it all happened. But certainly Susanna Candy, Sue Candy, was a gorgeous, blonde, 15-year-old schoolgirl who was a grade A student in high school. She was the daughter of a leading Perth surgeon, and she was hitchhiking home. We've got to remember this was the 80s, the mid-80s. It was a different time. Hitchhiking was very common by young people. There was nothing unusual in young people thumbing along at the side of the road and being picked up and taken home, which is what happened. Cathy and David would go trawling the highways, looking for young girls. They had some criteria. I explained the small stature of both of them. So they really needed their victims to be small of stature as well. They'd had a victim who they'd really struggled with, getting into the car, out of the car, into the grave. It's something that why would any of us think of that? But they'd experienced it, so they were looking for small-statured girls or young women. Susanna fit the bill. They'd also developed a code between them, so it would be Cathy who would wind the window down and do all the talking and invite the hitchhiker to get in. They picked up a lot of young girls. I mean, after they were arrested and the story came out, an awful lot of women came forward to say that they'd been picked up by the Birnies. But for whatever reason, the Birnies had taken them where they wanted to go, and that was it. And the reason for that is that Cathy had the power. the code they developed was a signal. And the signal was that Kathy, after the girl was in the car, if she turned to David and said, "I've got the munchies," that was the code that this was the girl that they were going to abduct that night. If she didn't say that, then he would drive where the girl wanted to go and she would get out and she'd be the luckiest girl alive and would never know about it. But with Susanna, Kathy said, "I've got the munchies." Kathy then gets in the back seat, pulls out the knife, pulls out Bubba, ties up Susanna. Eventually, they take her back to Morehouse Street, where the same thing happens, dreadful sexual assaults. And then, unlike Mary Nielsen, they decide not to kill her that night, but they force her to take sleeping tablets. The next morning, it's Kathy who threatens her with her knife and forces Susanna to ring her parents and tell them she'd gone away for a few days. She also made her write 3 separate letters repeating this lie. And long after Susanna has been killed by the Birnies, Kathy, a week apart, mails those letters. I mean, how cruel and despicable must that have been to mail those letters to her parents who are beside themselves because their daughter has vanished. And it's just giving them hope that she's still alive when she was long dead. But Susanna was killed the next day, the next night. Once again, it comes back to Kathy. Kathy told David Birnie that she wanted to demonstrate her total love for him. And so she wanted to be the one to kill Susanna while he watched. And this turned him on. He was excited by the idea. So Susanna was a bigger girl than Kathy, so they came up with the idea that they'd feed Susanna more sleeping tablets so that she was groggy. And then he put the nylon cord around her neck. And when she'd passed out, he handed it to Kathy, and she completed and strangled Susanna to death while he watched. And then they took her to the pine plantation and buried her about a kilometre away from where they'd put Mary Nielsen.
The next victim, Nolene Patterson, she was a little bit different, wasn't she? Because there was almost some sort of jealousy that sprung up between Catherine and David. What happened there?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Nolene was different to the first 2 girls who were young. Nolene was 31 and she'd lived a little bit in her life. At the time, she was the chief barmaid at a private golf club. Before that, she'd spent 8 years as a flight attendant on a private jet as well. So she'd seen a lot of the world and was worldly. In truth, she was everything that Kathy Birnie wasn't. She was poised, as I say, she was worldly and experienced, she was elegant and well educated. And Kathy was none of those things. And I think that David Birnie became captivated by Nolene pretty quickly. So driving home from the golf course after her night shift, her car broke down. It can happen, except my research makes me wonder that it wasn't all planned. David Birnie was a very good mechanic and he worked at a car dismantling yard. Nolene was a very savvy, never run out of petrol in her life. I believe that he doctored her car so that the car stopped. They just happened to be there. They offered to give her a lift to a local garage. Once she was in the car, Kathy did her thing, pulled out the knife, and they got her back to the house. Whereas I say, things changed a little bit. I think that Nolene realised pretty quickly and cleverly that her best chance of survival was to play on what she could clearly see was interest from David Birnie in her. And so she went out of her way to try to befriend him and make him feel special and that they may have a connection there. Of course, Kathy, who was watching on, making notes, was absolutely livid by this, that she had a love rival here in her eyes. Their initial plan was that Nolene would be murdered that same night, but David refused to do it. He refused to do it the second night. And so when you get to the third day, Kathy is epileptic at this, and she has a furious row with David Birnie, which Nolene, tied up and gagged and chained to the bed in the guest room, which all their victims were, would have clearly heard. Kathy took her knife out, held it to her own chest, and said to David that he had a decision to make. He had to choose between her or Nolene. And if he chose Nolene, then Kathy would kill herself because she loved him so much. And with that, she slammed the door and she left. And she spent the next 2 hours walking around the streets. When she got back, David Birnie told her that he'd made a decision and that he'd chosen her. Kathy was eager to dispose of Nolene then, but David said no, that he was going to do it himself. He insisted on doing it himself. So he gave her some sleeping tablets, and then later, when she'd passed out, he went into the bedroom alone and strangled her while she slept. Then he came out the room where Kathy was waiting, and she closed the bedroom door, turned to Kathy and said, "I've done it, it's over." They then wrapped Nolene in a carpet, got her into the car, drove her to the forest, and David dug the grave. And before he could start filling it, Kathy threw a fistful of dirt into Nolene's lifeless face, and that was all to do with Kathy.
David said that Nolene was different from the other girls and she deserved to be put into a different place to the other girls. She was in actual fact buried with her knickers still on and, as I say, away from the other two girls. But Kathy was the first one to point to Nolene's grave. In actual fact, when she walked up to the grave, she actually spat on the grave.
And 4 days later, there was 21-year-old Denise Brown, who was killed under similar circumstances. But the last victim is when things begin to differ, which is 17-year-old Kate Moyer. What happened to her?
Yeah, so you mentioned Denise Brown. I don't think, while the circumstances were very similar, there's something about Denise's death that really affects what happened with Kate Moyer. So Denise was hitchhiking, picked up, taken to Morehouse Street. The usual pattern was followed. But when it came to disposing, terrible word, but disposing of Denise, her death was particularly brutal. It was horrific. They drove out to the forest. Kathy then watched while David Birnie got into the back seat, on the back seat of the car, and raped Denise. He then dragged her out of the car and was assaulting her again when he suddenly took a knife and plunged it into her neck. He said to Kathy that he wanted to feel what it was like to have sex and kill at the same time. Kathy then handed him an even bigger knife and told him to do it again, and he stabbed Denise in the chest. They then put her in the makeshift grave that he'd dug. David Birnie was just about to start covering her with earth with a shovel when Denise sat up in the grave looking at them. Remarkable courage and bravery. David Birnie panicked. Kathy was completely speechless. David Birnie panicked, picked up an axe, swung it and hit her on the head, and she fell backwards. But as he bent down to pick up the shovel to fill the grave, she sat up again. And this time he brought the axe down on the top of her head, and she didn't move. Kathy Birnie told detectives later following her arrest that changed everything for her. I'm not sure how much we can put into that. She could have been telling the truth, but of course it was only a few days later that there they were out again trawling for other victims. So if it had affected her that much, why were they out looking for another victim? But anyway, that victim was Kate Moyer. Kate Moyer was a beautiful part-time model, 17-year-old high school dropout, who was a rebellious teenager. She loved her parents dearly, but wasn't getting on with them and had been living with her grandmother in Cottesloe, which is a beautiful beachside suburb in Perth. and she'd been out with a girlfriend at the Cottesloe pub, which a lot of people will know, where they had live music. She had several casual jobs, and one of them was it's an old expression, but a go-go dancer. She would dance at the side of the stage to the live band that was playing. On this night, her friend had gone off, leaving Kate to make her way home to her parents. She was going to visit her parents, who lived quite a few kilometres away. And Kate, luckily, was offered a lift by the band that had been playing that night. They took her on the highway, but then Kate was feeling a little bit groggy from the beer that she'd drunk, and she thought that she would walk the last kilometre and a half down the hill to the bungalow where her parents lived. So the band pulled their van over, Kate gets out, and she becomes aware she's wearing high heels, and her feet are a bit sore, she's not feeling the best after a big night, and she's aware of a red car that seems to be following her. Eventually the car pulls up, window is wound down, and Kathy Birnie asks her where she's going. And when Kathy says, "Oh, we're going in that direction, we'll give you a lift." Now, Kate was a very confident and, as I say, rebellious teenager who did a lot of hitchhiking, but she had a rule. And her rule was that she would never get in a car if it was just a man on his own. But if it was a couple and they looked okay, she would get in. Now, David and Kathy, as I've said, very slight of stature, both of them. They look as if they couldn't stand up in the wind. So Kate had no problems getting into the back of the car. 2-minute drive, they pull up outside her parents' bungalow, which is surrounded by a high fence and bushes. And so anyone in the house looking out wouldn't be able to see the car parked outside. And David Birnie turns around and says to Kate, invites her to get out the car. And Kate reaches to the side and realizes that the door handles have been removed. So David Birnie says, well, why don't you wind the window down, reach out and open the handle from the outside? The window handles had also been removed, so Kate was trapped in the back. And David and Kathy both laughed and thought this was hysterically funny. And they drove off, pulled up round the corner. Kathy gets in the back, ties up Kate, gags her, and they drive her back to Morehouse Street. Of all the young girls in Perth who would have been hitchhiking that night, possibly the only one who would be able to survive the ordeal would have been Kate Moyer. She's quite extraordinary. She has an IQ off the scale, and she decided very early on that she was probably not going to survive. And she was aware, Kate, that one or two young girls had gone missing in Perth over the previous few weeks, and Susanna Candy, the second victim, lived only 300 metres from Kate's parents, and she was only 2 years behind Kate in the same school. But what Kate decided to do was that she would engage in conversation and keep talking to David Birnie. It was David Birnie who she focused on. A bit like Nolene Patterson, I suppose. She was more combative, Kate, arguing with him and also talking to him about her own background. Her childhood was nowhere near as difficult as David's, but perhaps David Birnie saw a bit of a kindred spirit, I'm not sure. But Kate had an opportunity when they both left the room one time. She'd been forced by Kathy to write letters to her sister, her parents, and her boyfriend, like some of the other victims. But Kate had kept back a scrap of paper. She did a doodle. And in the doodle, if you looked closely enough, she'd written her full name and also the full name of her boyfriend. They lived in a bungalow, and there was a manhole cover in the roof to get access into the roof. And Kate stood on the back of the sofa, reached up and put this piece of paper in the void in the roof. Now that would become hugely important when she eventually escaped and police went to the house and arrested Kathy Birnie and later David Birnie. They initially denied everything, and there was no evidence at the house that they could see that tied them into any of the murders, or even that Kate had been there. But Kate was able to tell them that she'd hidden evidence in the house. And when the police got some step ladders and reached up and found this piece of paper, that's what did it for the Birnies. The police then knew that Kate wasn't a hysterical teenage girl who'd had a bad night with her boyfriend and was making up a story. They knew it was true and that she'd been in that house. But as to how she escaped, An awful time, the usual thing with Kathy. Lots of note-taking, lots of logging all her possessions and her belongings. Kathy threatening her, David Birnie raping her, Kathy watching. Kate was then tied up overnight. The next morning, David Birnie leaves for work. And Kate, who had listened to David Birnie describe lots of other victims and girls that they'd had in that house, she realised that when he got back from work, he was probably going to kill her and dispose of her. So then she started to work on Kathy Birnie. Kathy made her ring her parents at knife point. And then Kate suggested she'd like some fresh air. And Kathy took Kate outside to the porch. Now, the porch overlooked the main street. The house was set back a little bit from the driveway, but people walking past would have been able to see Kate on the porch. Kathy, of course, had a knife close by. But when they were talking, Kate said to Kathy, this is all very wrong, what you're doing to me. What is it about you? Why are you doing this? Have you ever suffered trauma in your life? And Kathy Birnie broke down at that point and started to cry and told Kate the story of how she'd witnessed the death of her son being run over by the car. It's Kate's belief that while Kathy Birnie quickly kind of composed herself and took her back in the house at knife point, that something kind of passed between them and that she dropped her guard a little bit, because soon after that there was a knock on the door, and it was the drug dealer who supplied the Birnies with the cannabis that they sold. And Kathy, who'd always been up until that point almost anal about tying Kate up, they actually chained her to the headboard in the spare guest bedroom and making sure that her gag was in her mouth. This time she locked her in, but she didn't bother tying her up. And Kate realised she was clothed, but she had no shoes on. She realised that that was her only chance. If she was going to escape, that was the moment. And there was a window. And it was one of those windows that are on a chain at the bottom, where you wind the handle and the window opens from the bottom. But it only opened a certain way, 6 or 12 inches or something. But Kate could hear Kathy talking to the drug dealer at the front door and knew that she had seconds to do something. So she counted down, and then she just ran and flung herself at the window. The chain, I think, must have snapped. I don't think the glass broke, because there's nothing in the police forensic report to say that. But Kate ended up on the other side, in the driveway at the side of the house. She thinks that she may have suffered concussion for a moment. When she came to, she jumped up and she just started to run. She ran across the road. She knocked on 3 different houses. Nobody answered. This would have been about 9 o'clock in the morning. Eventually then she ran down the driveway of the next house, climbed over a fence where there was a dog, but she managed to outrun the dog that was on a chain, I think, and then found there was a local shop that sold vacuum cleaners, strangely enough, and she ran in. She's not naked, but she's not wearing many clothes, and she's barefoot, and she's crying and she's cut. And at first, the owners of the store didn't know what to make of her. Eventually, she persuaded them to call the police, and the police arrived. And then we get into a remarkable situation where initially the male detectives didn't really believe Kate's story and thought, as I say, that she may have been a young girl who spent the night with a boyfriend and now was looking for an excuse. So they wanted to find a way of dealing with her. At the time at Fremantle, there were no female detectives at all. And in fact, there was only one female police officer on duty that day. And it was a young constable who'd only left the academy 5 months previously, very inexperienced, who they took Kate to. And that police officer, who I've interviewed, says that when they dropped Kate off, they said to her, write it up as a false report. She is adamant that they didn't believe Kate's story, and they just wanted her to take a quick statement and arrange for Kate to be taken home. She started to interview Kate, and her story is that it became apparent that Kate was telling the truth. So she, who had the run of this small suburban station, to herself. She was the only police officer on duty there that day. Interviewed Kate, and she made 13 phone calls to the Fremantle police station to speak to the senior detectives there, begging them, pleading with them to take this girl's story seriously. She says she made 13 phone calls, and several of the replies were that this would be the end of her career, that she should just do what she was told. Eventually, detectives got access to Morehouse Street. Cathy returned, was arrested, and the detectives went inside. They didn't find anything, bar one weird anomaly. It was 35 degrees that day, but there was burning embers in the hearth. Someone had burnt something. Didn't make any sense to the detectives. And that's when Laura, the young female police officer, rang up and told them to check the manhole cover in the ceiling. And the rest is kind of history. They did that, and then they realised that she had been there. What had Cathy burnt in the hearth? Well, police never ever found the notebooks or the clothing or anything. And I suspect that it was the notebooks, all those details of each of their victims that she'd burnt that day, before going and warning David Birnie that Kate had escaped.
What happened once David and Catherine were questioned by detectives?
That was a real nail-biting day because Laura, the young police constable, took Kate to Fremantle police station, where they continued to take her statement. In the room next door was Cathy Birnie being interviewed by detectives. The room next door to that was David Birnie being interviewed by detectives. Now, initially, both Birnies denied any knowledge of Kate or of any other women. The police had nothing to go on until, of course, they found the clues that Kate had left behind, as well as the note. Kate had told police that 2 of the sleeping tablets they'd given her, she'd pretended to take them, and then she'd used her nails to make a slit in the mattress, and she'd hidden the 2 orange sleeping tablets in the mattress. When police went and checked, when forensics went and checked, they found the 2 tablets. So they were on pretty solid ground, the police, that Kate had been in that house. There was a fair chance that they could bring charges for abduction. But the problem was that they didn't have anything else. They were on the clock then. They'd made the arrests. Amazingly, and the police still shake their heads to this day, neither Cathy nor David Birnie ever requested a solicitor. If they had, they may have got away with the murders completely. But for 7 hours, the police interviewed them, and neither of them would crack. Eventually, several hours in, David Birnie, confronted with the evidence that Kate had planted in the house and the police had found, he admitted that yes, he did know Kate. He'd picked her up the previous night. She'd willingly gone back to Morehouse Street, and she'd willingly had sex with him, consensual sex. Of course, the detective said, well, why would she hide evidence in the roof with her name and her boyfriend's name if that was the case? And slowly, David Birnie began to give more information, but nothing about other victims and other missing women. Until, as I say, 7 hours in, one of the detectives, a big bear of a man, who used his height and his bulk to almost intimidate the witness, leaned over David Birnie and said to him, look, why don't we just get a shovel, go out there, and let's bring this all to a conclusion. And David Birnie looked up and said, okay, let's go, there's 4 of them. And he broke and then started to talk. Meanwhile, next door, Cathy was the one who a psychiatrist would later say or claim that Cathy was the one who was besotted with David and would do anything that he wanted her to do. She never broke at all. She was refusing to confirm anything, knowledge of Kate or anything like that. Eventually, with the cooperation of David Birnie, they engineered it so that Cathy would have a toilet break. And when she walked out, in the corridor, they would arrange for David Birnie to be coming the other way with a police officer, and the two of them would meet. They coached David Birnie with what to say. And you had this moment where Cathy, who wasn't admitting to anything, this tiny little bird-like character, with all these big male detectives hammering her for hour after hour, and she hadn't given them anything. When she walks outside the room, she sees David Birnie, and they both hug one another. And David Birnie whispers in her ear, "I've told them everything." And Cathy steps back and looks at him. And then the police hustle them both apart. And Cathy goes back into the interview room. There's a moment's silence. And she looks up at the detective and she says, "What a weak prick." And she would then confirm a lot of the detail that David Birnie was giving to police. She never really offered information to the police, but she certainly confirmed details. And of course, what happened the next day was that they were put into separate cars. They were driven out to the pine plantation. David Birnie led police to the 4 graves of where the girls were buried, and Cathy would initially sit in the car watching him, and then she'd be taken to the grave as well, and she would give her side of the story. Of course, when she got to Nolene Patterson's grave, she spat on the grave. But they were eventually brought back. We get to court, and you're right, they pleaded guilty. A few things happened, though. David Birnie was dealt with first. There was initially a thought that Cathy may have been insane. That's when she had to be assessed by a psychiatrist and a psychologist, and she was found to be sane. But David Birnie, when he was sentenced, stood up and was allowed to read a statement to the court in which he said that he was pleading guilty basically to spare the families having to sit through a trial with all the evidence coming out. And he was sentenced, I forget how many years now. It's kind of immaterial because he would never have been released because of the nature of the crime. Cathy, when it came to her sentencing, and they were allowed to sit together in the dock. She was sitting with David Birnie when he was sentenced, and he was sitting with her weeks later, even though he'd been dealt with. They were allowed to sit together. At one stage, when David Birnie was sentenced, Cathy reached over and touched him lightly on the arm, and there were gasps in the court that she'd shown this kind of empathy towards him. It was remarkable. When it came to her sentencing, her barrister told the judge that she was the total disciple of Birnie and that she was prepared to follow him to the end of the earth and do anything necessary to see that his desires were satisfied, sentencing her as well to basically life imprisonment. The judge said, "You should never be released to join David John Birnie." And it was the last time that they were together, sat there. Cathy goes to a women's prison on the outskirts of Perth, and David Birnie goes to Fremantle. Now, I'll summarise it for you. The police were convinced that there were other victims, and I'm convinced that there are other victims. David Birnie couldn't cope with life in prison without Cathy. So many police officers went to the jails and interviewed David and Cathy, trying to get them to admit to other victims. And it became a game for Birnie and Cathy. They knew exactly what to say, and it was almost sport to them, who were bored in prison life, knowing that the detectives were hanging on their every word. It all kind of changed, though. In the first few years of their sentences, David and Cathy Birnie wrote to each other copiously. Something like 2,600 letters passed between them, until Cathy just kind of cut off all contact. And this sent David Birnie into a real depression. He couldn't understand why. And he was contacted there's a civil rights campaigner over in Perth, a really interesting character, one of the first Aboriginal justices of the peace in WA. And he contacted David Birnie, and to cut a long story short, they had an extraordinary private meeting in the jail. Not at ordinary visiting time, this was a special meeting. The campaigner, and I've interviewed him, says that David Birnie confessed to 3 more victims. And he offered a deal. If the Attorney General would allow Cathy to visit him for the weekend, he would take police to the 3 bodies and show them where they were buried and clear the matters up. But the Attorney General, he said, had to come to the jail and tell him that the deal was on. And of course, politically, the Attorney General couldn't do that. He couldn't go to the jail. So it didn't happen immediately, but the civil rights campaigner continued to campaign, continued to try and put, those 3 families out there. He wanted closure for them. So he went one higher. He actually got the governor of Western Australia to grant a warrant giving David Birnie access to Cathy, i.e. that Cathy could be moved to David Birnie's prison for the weekend so they could be together. In return, David Birnie had to publicly confess and reveal the location of the bodies. It was a done deal. The police had their cars all ready to make the transfer, and it would seem that, we were going to get to the bottom of the mystery of how many victims the Birnies had. And it was Cathy who refused to take part in the deal. She even refused to take a telephone call from Birnie. She told someone at the time that she felt that he was weak, that she was stronger than him, and she didn't need him anymore. David Birnie died in prison in 2005. It was 19 years to the day since the abduction and murder of Mary Nielsen. And he'd promised to leave the civil rights campaigner a letter giving the details, but there was no letter. Cathy, 2 interesting things happened with Cathy following Birnie's death. She's left on her own again. She'd lost her baby brother and her mother in childbirth. She'd lost her grandmother, who she lived with for a while, and here she was again on her own. But she continued to write, not to David Birnie, but to perhaps the most exclusive and frightening pen pal kind of partnerships that you could imagine. She began writing to Myra Hindley, who was one half of the Moors murderers, who along with Ian Brady murdered several children in the UK. And the 3rd member of this writers group was Eileen Wuornos, who was a Florida prostitute who shot and killed 7 of her male clients. 3 of the most, some would say, evil women in the world, in Australia, in America and the UK, were writing to each other. You just love to get your hands on some of that correspondence, but what did they talk about? What secrets did they share? I suspect they may have made a pact together, because Myra Hindley made a full confession. It was about 30,000 words. She named extra victims, more victims than people knew about. She expressed remorse. And then she made parole applications, but they were all rejected. And she died of a heart attack or heart failure in jail in 2002, never having had another day of freedom. Weeks before she died, before Myra Hindley died, Eileen Wuornos also died. She was executed with a lethal injection. She'd been sentenced to death in Florida. But just weeks before, she also made a full confession of her crimes, like Hindley. She wasn't asking for forgiveness. She wasn't asking for parole. She just wanted to get it off her chest. And she wrote to her trial judge and she said, I killed those men and I'd do it again too. I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. So, 2 down, that left Cathy. And what would she do? Well, it seemed initially that Cathy was going to do the same thing. She was going to reveal and make a full confession, reveal more victims. She contacted that civil rights campaigner who'd been visiting David Birnie and had set up the deal that she'd rejected. He went to visit her in jail. Again, a very special meeting, a private meeting, just the 2 of them. He's described it to me as bizarre and weird. They had general chit-chat for about half an hour. And then Cathy asked him what David Birnie had said about the other victims and her role. The campaigner, whose name is Brian, I think probably made the wrong choice, but he decided to level with her and he told her everything that Birnie had said about there being 3 more victims. And he said that Kathy just looked at him for quite some time. She stared right through him. She didn't answer. She didn't respond. And he realised that all she wanted was the intelligence, was to have that feeling of power. And she wasn't going to tell him, and she didn't. And he left the jail without any answers. And kind of my last insight into Kathy would be I interviewed somebody who worked at the jail casually and got to know Kathy, who became the head librarian at the jail. And one day, Kathy was discussing the case of Lindy Chamberlain. And this worker was upset with Kathy's tone and what she was saying, and she told her so. And suddenly Kathy grabbed her and pushed her up against a wall in the library and told her, "You don't know what power is. Nobody knows what power is until you hold somebody's life in their hands. Look into their eyes and take it all away from them." And this woman, who was used to working in prisons and had seen a lot of people, said that the hairs on the back of her neck just stood up. And she, looking at Kathy then, even though, as I say, Kathy was barely over 5 foot tall, was absolutely frightening. And she had no doubt that you were dealing with somebody, with Kathy, who was an absolute master manipulator, but someone who could hide their true dark self. And it was the most frightening experience she'd ever had.
That feels like it sums Catherine up pretty adequately.
I would say that the book I'm writing about the Birnies is not quite yet finished. I know that there are other people out there, including Kathy herself, of course, who might still to this day want to talk. I'm easily found on social media, and I'd love to hear from anybody who has information, particularly about Kathy.
Yeah, that's a really good
No
point.
worries, it's been a pleasure.
To get as much sort of information. Wouldn't it be great just to have her talk? Do you think she will?
Oh, look, I don't think so. I think, like a lot of these people, see, David Birnie did talk to people. There was a couple of journalists and researchers, criminologists, who he would ring up and talk to for hours, you know. But when it comes to discussing the other victims and that kind of thing, they kind of know that it's one of the reasons people keep talking to them is because we want to know this information. Once they've given the information, there's no reason for people to talk to them. And they fear the kind of, what that would mean. So they have this power. It's the only thing they've got left. It's this knowledge they have, and they're very reluctant to give it up. And I don't think that Kathy ever will give it up. Look, the government over there have changed the law now. Kathy has been ruled never to be released. So it's not kind of where you could dangle a carrot to her again and say, you're eligible for parole now if you tell us where the bodies are and how many victims there are. They can't offer her that now. She's in a very stable lesbian relationship in there with another prisoner. She gets 3 meals a day. She's institutionalized. She's Queen Bee, because of her notoriety. I don't think there's any motivation for her to revisit the past or to say anything, to bring closure at all. It's just not going to happen, I don't think. It's fascinating. She wrote to her children just before she was sentenced, the children she'd walked out on and abandoned, and said to them that she hoped that they would never get into trouble in their lives and they should do as their father says, and that, that she loved them very, very much. Well, Don, the husband, despite what she'd done with Birnie, he still carried a candle for her. He took those kids to visit her at least once a month for the first 10 years of her sentence. And I've spoken to one of her sons, and the sons say that it was a 4-hour drive. So he'd put them all in the car, drive them for 4 hours. Then it took 2 hours to go through security at the jail because they all had to be searched. They all had to be patted down. And then they'd have like a 45-minute meeting with Kathy either side of this wooden table. And her son, Peter, said to me that all Kathy did, she never asked the kids one thing. She never asked them how their lives were, what they were doing, how school was. She just talked to Don, and all she wanted to know was what people were saying about her, what was being written about her, what were the newspapers saying about her. And she ignored the kids completely. And so it's been a few months now, but the last I heard, none of the children keep in contact with Kathy or have contact with Kathy, besides sporadically maybe one daughter. And Kathy has multiple grandchildren now. She's a grandmother. But none of those grandkids, many of them don't even know who she really is, and they don't have any contact with her.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. We really appreciate it.
No worries, it's been a pleasure.
If you or anyone you know may have information about the Birnies and would like to contact Andrew Byrne, you can reach out via the link in the description of this episode. To discuss this episode and others featured on the podcast, you can join our closed Facebook group. Just search True Crime Conversations on Facebook. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast hosted by me, Jessie Stevens. Our technical producer is Luca Lavigne, and our executive producer and editor is Elise Cooper.